panel found they committed gross misconduct when they strip-searched a 15-year-old girl at school. The teenager, who's black, was wrongly suspected of having cannabis and was on her period at the time. An investigation concluded race wasn't a factor in the decision to search her, but Scotland Yard admits it's damaged the trust London's black communities have in the police. Cathy Cashel from the police watchdog says a search wasn't authorised and no responsible adult was present.
We have spoken to stakeholders in Hackney, across London, but also across the UK, and particularly young people and those from black communities have expressed real concern about this case and talked about the impact that it has had on public confidence.
The Prime Minister's confirmed he's in talks with Labour rebels ahead of a Commons vote next week on his controversial welfare reforms. More than 120 Labour politicians are urging Sir Keir Starmer to rethink the proposed changes. Dozens of college students have been injured after a double-decker bus crashed into the River Itchen in Hampshire. The operator says the driver and 4 others were taken to hospital. Ofcom says major pornography websites have agreed to implement tougher age protections, including credit card checks and facial age recognition. Any sites that fail to comply with the rules by this time next month could be fined or blocked through a court order. Oliver Griffiths is from the regulator and told LBC this will make a real difference.
Dedicated kids are going to find the way around it sometimes in the same way as they find their way into pubs. But from our research, the real problem that we see, or a real problem, is that people just stumble across porn and then find that it's only one click away. And so we've got, from our research, 500,000 8 to 14-year-olds that are online in a typical month.
Anna Wintour is stepping down as editor-in-chief of American Vogue after 37 years. She'll remain as the parent company's chief content officer, as well as global editorial director of Vogue, overseeing the fashion magazine's worldwide output. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 28 points at 87.46. The pound buys $1.37 and €1.17. LBC weather. Clouding over in the north this evening, rain spreading east overnight, clear spells elsewhere and a low of 11 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Simon Marks.
And I'm in for Ian Dale for one more night. Rachel Johnson here tomorrow from 7, of course, and Ian back in this chair on Monday. Now, in the next hour, we are going to join forces and we're going to make sure that we are not like Senator Ted Cruz, the Trump-supporting Republican from Texas.
How many people live in Iran, by the way?
I don't know the population.
At all?
No, I don't know the population.
You don't know the population of the country you seek to topple?
How many people live in Iran?
92 million.
Okay. Yeah,
How could you not know that?
I don't sit around memorizing population tables.
Well, it's kind of relevant because you're calling for the overthrow of the government.
Why is it relevant whether it's,
because,
it's 90 million or 80 million or 100 million? Why is that relevant?
Because if you don't know anything about the country...
I didn't say I don't know anything about
Okay, what's the ethnic mix of Iran?
They are Persians and predominantly Shia. Okay,
it's not even... You don't know anything about Iran. So
okay, I am not the Tucker Carlson expert on Iran.
You're a senator who's calling for the overthrow of the government.
You're the one who
know anything about the country.
Senator Ted Cruz being destroyed last week by former Fox News personality Tucker Carlson. It doesn't matter how many times I hear that, it never gets old. So tonight, after a fortnight in which we have all talked extensively about Iran, we're going to take some steps to put meat on the bones of our knowledge about the country. At least we now know that it's a country of 92 million people. Our guide for the next hour is Rob Macaire. He served as Britain's ambassador to Iran from 2018 until 2021, and it is worth noting that among other positions he has held, he served as the head of the Counter-Terrorism Policy Department in the Foreign Office. That may become relevant to our conversation as well. So he brings a lot of expertise to the chat that we're going to have for the next hour. His time as our man in Tehran was to say the least, colourful. He was arrested in January 2020 during protests in Tehran after attending a vigil for those people killed when Iranian forces downed a Ukrainian passenger plane. All 167 passengers and 9 crew aboard died. He also saw an effigy of him being burnt by protesters as the country's judiciary described him as an undesirable element. So far, so stereotypical in terms of modern Iranian behaviour. But tonight, I want to go behind the stereotypes and try to understand the country in as much of its complexity as we can cover. The story of Iran is not binary. And while we all have views of the 1979 revolution that brought the Ayatollah Khomeini to power, and no doubt views about the Shah of Iran and the way he governed the country before he was toppled, tonight, let's learn a bit more about Iran, its past, and what its future might eventually look like. Can it ever return to a position of responsibility in the family of nations? Rob Macaire is here for the full hour. More than happy to take your questions about Iran, and I'm especially keen to hear from you if you've ever been there or always wanted to go. But no matter what your question is, you can call us now at 0345 6060 973. It's the same number for WhatsApp. You can text us at 84850. You can ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. And if you've ever wondered what I look like, or much more importantly, what Rob Macaire looks like, you can watch this hour live on the LBC app and the Global Player. Rob Macaire, welcome to the programme. I am enormously grateful to you for putting an hour of your time to one side for us tonight. Can I just go back to a week ago? I mean, you, like the rest of us, will have woken up on Sunday morning, not even a week ago, to learn that President Donald Trump had ordered those airstrikes on Iran's nuclear sites. What were your immediate thoughts when you heard that news?
Well, Simon, thanks. I mean, I don't think it was a surprise, because obviously it had been trailed a lot in advance. President Trump likes to keep people guessing, so he makes a virtue of unpredictability and of keeping people wrong-footed. So there was all this, will he, won't he, beforehand. But given that Israel had taken the step that has been, again, talked about for the last 15 years or so of taking military action against Iran's nuclear program, given how far they got, but they didn't have the deep bunker busting bombs to take out the Fordo site. So there was a logic to him, President Trump, ordering that strike. And I think what my first reaction to it was, this should give the president the opportunity to take ownership of this and say to the Israeli government, okay, we've taken over, we've made these final strikes, this is now done, let's wind this back and have a ceasefire, which is of course what he did. So I think it was an effective segue from the military to the ceasefire.
Did you think that there was any possibility that we would see further drama that would threaten the ability of the regime in Iran to stay in power?
I think you have to be very cautious when you make predictions about regime staying in power, because let's face it, we never ever have got it right in the past, and we've never foreseen these things. So you need to approach the subject with a bit of modesty. But I think from my understanding of the country and the politics there, it just seems highly unlikely that airstrikes were ever going to lead to a regime change. And I also think people mean very different things when they talk about regime change. Some people think that it's that it has to be a big Hollywood moment, with the crowd storming the palace and a better government being installed. But of course, actually, the most likely thing in Iran is that a regime change consists of a military leader or group coming forward and sidelining the existing regime, and particularly the religious leaders, and imposing a military government.
But there have been so many moments over the last 18 months where the hopes, certainly of Iranians living in the UK, I've spoken to a couple of people that I know from Iran here in the UK, and also the hopes of people from Lebanon, many of them living in the UK, have been raised that there was the possibility finally of regime change. The protests that arose out of the killing of Mahsa Amini, the young woman who was hauled off the streets by Iran's secret police for incorrectly wearing her hijab and then killed while in custody. There was tremendous optimism in many quarters that those protests would ultimately force the Supreme Leader and his cronies from power. It wasn't to be. Last weekend, you could sense, talking to people that keep a much closer eye on events there than I do, that they thought, again, people from the region, might this be the moment? What does it take for the moment to occur? Or is it going to be like Syria? I mean, unthinkable until the week in which it happens.
Well, not unthinkable. I mean, this is a regime that is deeply, deeply unpopular in the country, of course. And I found living there that people from all walks of life would very happily talk about how much they despise the regime. It's really only has a relatively small core of people who support it. So it's unpopular, and it's also the legitimacy or the sort of, the credibility that a government gets, even if it's not democratic, even if it's unpopular. If it's providing some sort of economic benefit to the people or providing some sort of hope for the future, then you get this sort of unspoken deal sometimes. But that has really leaked away over the last 5 years or so in Iran completely. So I think it's obviously a regime that is in the last phase of its life. But given that it can deploy so much force on the streets, and given that people saw that in the demonstrations after Mahsa Amini's killing, a lot of very brave people came out on the streets and protested. A lot of people were killed, a lot of people were arrested. And the regime is prepared to use any amount of brutality to put down these protests. So I think people are realistic about that. And I also just want to add one other thought that I think is worth thinking about when you try and talk about how Iranians think about this. A lot of people will say that at the top of their mind is the worry that what comes next is chaos. And it's a very big country with a lot of potential divisions in it. And they have seen what has happened to other countries in the region that have ended up in civil war, in chaos, and in years of an even worse situation than they have under this ghastly regime. So people are very conscious of that.
Yeah, and I think it's been very clear over the last week that neither the Americans nor the Israelis have a sense of what the day after necessarily looks like. We're getting a huge number of questions for you, and I want to start with this one from Rich in Hull, who asks, if I were walking through central Tehran on a normal day as a tourist, as in a day, unsullied by American or Israeli military action, would I feel safe and would I be welcomed?
So that's quite an easy question to start with. And I should say, before I start, by the way, I'm sure there are lots of Iranians and Iranian origin people, listening to this and who have much deeper and longer knowledge of the country than I do. I'm a foreigner who's lived there for a bit and has worked on these issues. But just with that caveat, the answer to that is absolutely. It was, when the whole time that we lived there, you felt you were in a country that obviously there's relatively little street crime. There isn't really a terrorism threat. That's partly because it's a police state, so it is, has less of disorder. But there were very few places, very few times that you'd feel unsafe. Even late at night, even in unfamiliar areas. It's a city you could walk through, and where people were genuinely welcoming to foreigners. You go to a shop, or you get a taxi or anything, and you find that people were enthusiastic to meet foreigners.
We're getting lots of calls and questions via text for Rob Macaire, and you can join the programme by calling 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850. What is Iran actually like as a country, and how could what Donald Trump refers to as the 12-day war shape its future? Don't forget you can watch us live on the LBC app and on Global Player as well. well, as we head into the break, I want to bring you a couple of elements from the LBC archive, because as you can imagine, this radio station has spent a lot of time over many years covering events in Iran, and I dipped into the archive tonight and went back to February the 1st, 1979, which is the day that the Ayatollah Khomeini left Paris and returned to Iran. And LBC covered the story in both Paris and Tehran. Let's start in Paris, where the reporter was Ian Murray.
Security was at its tightest at the airport for the departure of the Ayatollah. The supporters, brandishing portraits of the Ayatollah, chanted slogans like, "Long live the anti-imperialist fight," "Stop the massacre of the Iranian people," and "Death to the Shah," as they waited for their leader to arrive. He was there at midnight and went straight to departure lounge number 4, where a prepared statement thanking the French nation for their hospitality was read out. Then he boarded the aircraft.
And hours later, of course, he arrived in Tehran to throngs of eager supporters, and reporter Keith Miller covered that for LBC.
Under clear blue skies, the Ayatollah Khomeini is returning home to a hero's welcome. Millions of his followers wave portraits and give the sign of victory. Khomeini has once again called for the resignation of the Bakhtiar government, saying he will soon announce his own provisional government. All along the parade route, the people shout in joy. Young children caught up in the excitement wave flowers and dance with the chaos. So far, there has been no sign of any masses of troops. The government said it would not interfere with Khomeini's return, and it appears the people here will have their way, at least for today.
At least for today. It's extraordinary hearing that so many years later. The sense of possibilities that existed on the streets of Tehran as the Ayatollah Khomeini arrived back in February of 1979. More of your questions for Rob Macaire, the former British ambassador to Iran. Call us at 0345 6060 973 or text us at 84850. The time is 17 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Simon Marks on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
And we are all learning this hour about Iran. We're joined for the full hour by Rob Macaire, the former British ambassador to Iran. And let's go to the phone lines. And we've got a question from Amin in Kingston for Rob Macaire. Good evening, Amin. What's your question?
Good evening, gentlemen, for having me on. My question is, it's about the, Iranian society, Western society, that how much, as a people, someone who lived for I don't know, Mr. Rob, how long he stayed there.
Rob was there for 3 years,
Okay. How do he think that, Western countries and Western society have a, full picture of, Iranian society wishes? Bear in mind, the normal, ordinary people who want to trust a country, still, I believe that there is still unhealed wounded in Iranian society when they're thinking about the Western countries, about the coup during the Mossadegh time. Even the supporters of Shah, the majority of them, they think that there wasn't any revolution in Iran. It was, Western coup against the Shah, and even the majority of them, they called the mullahs in Iran, they called them British mullahs.
I mean, your phone line is slightly breaking up, but I think we got the sense of the question, Rob Macaire. I think Amin is essentially asking, how clear-eyed are Western societies and Western governments about what has taken place in Iran, not just in recent years, but going back all the way to 1979? And how clear-eyed is the Iranian government and its supporters about the West?
Well, it's a really, really good question, that. I mean, and there's a couple of things to unpack there, I guess. One is, at the moment, of course, Iran is quite cut off from Western countries. I mean, the normal way that people find out about the country is tourism, and tourism's been very limited, even in good times. And it's been difficult and expensive to get to Iran as tourists. So there's a lot of that. A lot of Iranians come out of the country. Does that sort of flow out and have these amazing, successful diaspora all around the world? But in terms of understanding what's happening inside the country, I think you're right to say that the West doesn't really have a real picture of it. And as we were saying just now, actually, when people come out and visit, the first thing they tend to all say is, well, there's a lot more normal, this place, than I thought from reading the news or hearing about it, or just hearing about what the government gets up to, because it's a big country with a lot of people. And, people get on with living their lives. They have a terrible regime and they have to navigate their way around that. But it is basically a country with a very deep historical popular culture. And I think the other side of that question, which is really interesting, is about the history, and particularly the history between the UK and Iran, which is really complicated and which people in Iran feel very strongly about. And the government has slightly exaggerated some of it, maybe in the way that it's taught and the way that it's expressed. But people in the West don't get that at all. People in the UK have no idea about that history. And the history includes, as Amin was saying on his call, about the 1953 coup against Prime Minister Mossadegh, which had sort of UK and US involvement. And it goes back to the oil concession, and it goes back to treaties in the 19th century. And a lot of this stuff, it maybe is exaggerated, but some of it is very much real, that Iran feels badly treated by the UK.
And Rob, as the man who, between 2018 and 2021, was basically overseeing the transmission of information to the British government about the situation in Iran, what's it like operating as the top British diplomat in the country? How much freedom do you have to travel? How much access do you get to the upper echelons of the Iranian government? Did you ever encounter the supreme leader, for example, or are you dealing with the president and his administration more normally? What does that look like?
Yeah, well, obviously it's quite constrained, and you know that when you go out there, when you take up the job. This is, it's a lot of the diplomacy there is making bricks without straw, both in terms of your access and in terms of the information that you can get. So every piece of information is valuable, and every piece of negotiation that you can get done is valuable. I would say, although diplomats don't get to meet the supreme leader, diplomats don't tend to get to meet the IRGC, who are senior generals who are in charge of a lot of stuff. That'd be different if you were a Russian diplomat, but for Western diplomats, not the case. And the UK, because of course there hasn't been an American embassy there since the hostage crisis in 1979, and obviously no Israeli embassy, and so the UK is sort of, for the regime, public enemy number one. So yes, as British ambassador or as a British diplomat there, you're followed everywhere. Your phone is listened to. You're under a sort of certain amount of pressure. But, for the first half of my time there, I was able to travel around, see the country, meet people. The government tries to keep you in a box and you try to get out of it the whole time. It got a bit more difficult after the Soleimani killing, and the things got, the relationship got a lot more tense.
When you see yourself being burnt in effigy, what's that experience like?
I think you have to take that with a sense of humour, really. I mean, it wasn't exactly a massive crowd of people baying for my blood. It was a sort of rent-a-mob dozen people from the Parliament, sort of with the standard anti-British response. So yeah, I think I regard it as an honour to be part of that select club.
I was going to say badge of honour. Let's go to David in Enfield. Good evening, David. What's your question for Rob Macaire?
Good evening. How much historical responsibility does the UK bear for the current situation in Iran? Because I heard you just talking now about the 1953 coup, when Britain and America conspired to stage a coup d'etat against a popular democratically elected prime minister and replaced him with the Shah. And then, of course, the Shah's rule eventually, the repressive rule, led to the return of Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979. As you can hear from the sort of tape that was played, he was obviously very popular when he returned.
Rob, are those historic roots one of the reasons why we have such tremendous tensions with Iran today?
There's a lot in the history. I mean, and I think the history has fed into, some deep views in society about, the UK being this mastermind that's in charge of everything. And people say, well, even American policy, it was the British pulling the strings. So, I mean, the joke for British diplomats going out there is it's a great posting. It's the only country that still thinks Britain's a superpower. So the history undoubtedly has an effect. I don't think you can draw a direct line between the 1953 coup and the fall of Mossadegh through to 1979, but obviously that history has a part of that impact. And the nature of the Shah's rule and the Shah's relationship with the West, with the US and the West, and the speed of social change that was very threatening to people who are sort of conservative and religious, was all part of what the tension that built up, as was a repressive government with a secret police and a lot of disgruntled constituencies. So the revolution in '79 is a complicated thing to interpret. It would be hard to blame it all on the British, but I think the British do get blamed by both sides. As this is not only by the regime, but I think, as the earlier caller was saying, there was people saying, well, if you lifted up the Ayatollah's beard, it would say "Made in Britain" underneath it. Which obviously doesn't really have much validity to it, but the perception's really important.
Let me just bring David back in. David, I get from the sense from your question that you definitely think there is a through line there.
Well, I mean, if that popular democratically elected prime minister hadn't been overthrown, and it was because he was threatening the interests of British Petroleum in Iran, threatening to nationalise the company, then the Shah wouldn't have been installed, and wouldn't have been, the repressive years of the Shah regime that led to the Ayatollah Khomeini coming back as a hero, as a liberator. So I think there is a direct line.
Rob?
So, I mean, it's a complicated historical debate. Obviously, the Shah wasn't an alternative to Mossadegh. The Shah appointed Mossadegh, and it was in his gift to appoint him or sack him. And so, there was. It's difficult to know what would have happened if Mossadegh had stayed in power. I think it might be a bit of a sort of bit of a long conversation to get into precisely how the events of 1953 played out and played forward into '79.
David, thanks for the question. Rob, you mentioned the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps. There is a lot of debate now, once again, about whether the government should be prescribing them as a terrorist organisation. Where do you come down on that debate?
Well, I think it can be a bit of a red herring. I mean, what's really important is that the security services and the police are able to crack down on the threat that Iran poses on our streets, which is serious, and it's obviously mainly a threat to journalists and dissidents, and also to Israeli and Jewish targets. And it's important that the government has all of the levers that it should do to deal with that. Now, my sense is that the practitioners who actually have that job don't feel that prescription as a terrorist organisation itself would give them any more tools to do that. But it seems an awful lot of sort of heat and light goes on that particular question, rather than saying, have we got the right resources to deal with this? Are we dealing with it the right way? Are we putting the right pressure on Iran?
So, but you think we should or we shouldn't?
I'm not sure it would be top of my list in terms of practical things that make a difference.
OK. We are getting so many questions for Rob Macaire, both by telephone and by text. I think later in the hour we may have to do a lightning round. And I'm grateful to all of you for embracing the opportunity to talk about Iran in more detail, because I think we all talk about it more generally in kind of stereotypical terms. And it's fantastic to spend a full hour really trying to understand more about the country. You can call us at 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850. You can ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. The time is 29 minutes to 9, and the news headlines come from Daryl Jackson.
The Metropolitan Police has apologised, and 2 officers have been sacked for gross misconduct after a 15-year-old girl was strip-searched at school. The teenager had been wrongly accused of possessing cannabis in East London in 2020. Ofcom says major pornography websites have agreed to implement tougher age protections, including credit card checks and facial age recognition. Any sites that fail to comply with the rules by this time next month could be fined or blocked through a court order. 7 people are in hospital after a bus carrying sixth form students crashed into a river in Hampshire. The driver's among those hurt after the double-decker came off the road near Eastleigh. LBC weather: clouding over in the north this evening, rain spreading east overnight, clear spells elsewhere, and a low of 11 degrees.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation, LBC, with Simon Marks.
Now, normally when I'm on the air, I am keeping a beady eye on Donald Trump's social media feed. But tonight, I'm keeping a beady eye on the social media feed of Iran's supreme leader, the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And while we've been on the air, he has been taking to X to publish a whole series of messages about the military action that has taken place in his country over the last few days. 6 minutes ago, he wrote, or someone on his behalf wrote, the Zionist regime, by which of course he means Israel, must know that attacking the Islamic Republic of Iran will result in a heavy cost for them. Iranians, a nation of approximately 90 million people, stood together and supported the actions of the armed forces. The Iranian nation demonstrated its greatness and exceptional character in this event, he writes. And he says that the Iranian nation is victorious and will remain victorious by the grace of God. He also put out some video of himself today, very difficult to to know where exactly he was, sitting in front of a curtain flanked by an Iranian flag. There have, of course, been reports that he's been taken off to an undisclosed location and has been in hiding. But it is extraordinary to live in a moment where, quite literally, the American president and the Iranian supreme leader are able to communicate with all of us and potentially with one another by social media. We're talking to Rob Macaire, the former British ambassador to Iran, who is taking your questions on what life in the country is like. And let's go to Dom, who has called in from Aberdeen tonight. Dom, good evening to you. What would you like to say?
Yeah, good evening, gents. So I just wanted to share kind of my experience in Iran. In 2018, I was backpacking around for 6 weeks, and the reason for the call is all the news you see is so negative around Iran, and it's driven by the regime, and I think it reflects unfair reflection on the Iranian people. So I arrived over the border in the north on a Friday, and all the money exchanges were closed, so I couldn't exchange my dollars. So I was wandering around, and then this guy pulled up. He said, "Hello, where are you from? And do you need any help?" I thought, right, I'm not getting anywhere with this. So I said, "Yeah, I need to exchange money." So he said, "Jump in," and he took me to the local bazaar. Checked the exchange rate was, the actual black market rate, the good exchange rate. I exchanged $200, and then he said, "Right, what are your plans? What are you doing?" I said, "I need to get a bus." They then drove me, 10, 15 minutes to the bus station, helped me buy my bus ticket, and then he drove me back into town and said, "Right, you've got 4 hours till your bus. I'll drop you at this cafe. You can have lunch." And he didn't want anything in return. I gave him a bar of chocolate. And then I went into this cafe, kind of pointed at what I wanted, and by the time it came to pay, I was quite naive. I'd exchanged the $200, and the guy didn't speak any English. I didn't speak any Farsi. I just held my wallet out in front of him, kind of opened it up, and like $200 is a lot of money, particularly in Iran with the exchange rate. And he fished some notes out, and I checked back later because I thought that's the stupid thing to do, but I checked, and he'd only pulled out 80 cents worth, not even $1. And then, it was just a brilliant time, the whole 6 weeks.
Dom, was this the Iran you were expecting to find?
Yeah, to an extent, because I'd met some Iranians. I was backpacked around in Georgia, and they'd actually said to me, if an Iranian offers you help, 99% of the time is genuine. So I was expecting a little bit of that. There's still a bit of trepidation about getting into a stranger's car, but I wasn't prepared for just how gracious and hospitable they were. And I just wanted to share that because that's not something you hear about.
I'm glad you did, Dom. Thanks very much indeed for calling in. Rob Macaire, on a grassroots level, is that what you experienced and others working in the British Embassy, for example, experienced when you were able to travel around the country?
Yeah, 100%. And it's great to hear that call from Dom. I mean, it's absolutely a familiar story for so many times. There's sort of random acts of kindness by strangers, but going way above and beyond what you expect the normal hospitality to tourists might be that you get in many countries. It really is it's an amazing experience being there, and I think people who we encountered were very often absolutely delightful, and I think it's really great to just remind people about that. It's just the regime who are utterly ghastly.
Yeah, well, we would be remiss if we did not also say to people that it is a risky thing to travel there, and I'm mindful of the experience that Craig and Lindsay Foreman are going through tonight in Iran. They are two British tourists who were charged back in February with espionage by the Iranian government. They were arrested in the city of Kerman. They were there on a trip around the country, part of international travel that they were engaged in throughout the region. And Rob, Rob, you would have been the diplomat had you been there now, trying to assist them. What is that process like, helping British citizens who get into difficulty in Iran? And that really does it not colour any thoughts that under current circumstances we should all be having about heading there to engage in tourism?
Yes, it does. And you're absolutely right to point that out. I mean, that's the distinction I was trying to make between really, really hospitable people in Iran and this regime, which is paranoid, irrational, and dangerous. And that's why, and obviously they have a history of arresting people, foreigners, and particularly dual nationals in the country on no, even plausible justification. And these are really horrendous cases, and we dealt with a number of them while I was there. This has gone on for years. As you say, there's some very, very tragic cases going on at the moment. So the regime is unpredictable and paranoid. But it's one of those things that to the vast majority of people there, this doesn't affect you. But if it does, it is catastrophic.
Malcolm has sent a question in on text. He asks, is there a Jewish community in Iran, and is it safe?
So there is a Jewish community in Iran. It's small, but like the Armenian Christian population there and Syriac population, they are constitutionally protected. So they have, there's a member of parliament to represent the minorities, and there is a, they're able to worship, and they're able to live their lives, as are the Zoroastrian population of the country. But they are, it is a token, it's a tiny presence, this is very much a window dressing to show how tolerant the regime is. And if anyone, particularly from the Zoroastrian community, tries to step outside it and do anything political, they tend to get stamped on very hard. And of course, the Baha'i faith is deeply, deeply persecuted in Iran, and as are other Christian groups who come in who are not part of that traditional Armenian Christian community. So that these historic communities have constitutional protection and are able to live their lives if they keep their heads down.
And am I right in saying, Rob, and maybe it's nothing more than a constitutional fig leaf, but am I right in saying that there have even been Jewish members of the Iranian parliament?
Yes, I'd say that there is guaranteed representation for the minorities in the parliament. But, it is, it's a bit of a token.
Let's go back to the phone lines. John has called in from Woodford. John, what's your question for Rob Macaire?
Oh, hello. Sorry, I've got to turn... Oh, God, what have I done? Yes, can you hear me?
We can hear you, absolutely. Want to give it a go, John?
I think what I want to say is I'm getting on a bit, and I've seen Cuba crisis, I've seen all sorts of things. We need something to come and save us from this mess that's going on in the world. There's so many wars, so much starvation. Now, we need somebody that can be strong, a saviour. Of course, there was a chap in the Bible, but that's not necessarily going to happen. Trump is my last idea of a saviour, but the one thing he has got is this thing about wanting to stop wars, which I agree with, and many people in the world agree with. He does it in a strange way, and I'm now having second thoughts about this bombing that he did, because he might have shaken the Iranians up into doing something, and maybe that could turn better for themselves to turn their country around, rather than Iraq, that didn't get a chance because we just went in like a bunch of cowboys. And do you know what I mean, Simon? You understand what I'm trying to say?
I understand the question, John. I think, Rob, what John is basically asking is, has all of the action that we've seen over the last couple of weeks, and particularly the action by the American military last weekend, at least sown the seeds, potentially, for some kind of additional popular uprising?
Well, it may have done. I think that if there is some sort of uprising, it'll come as people assess the situation and say, well, this government, this regime has put so much effort into a nuclear program that's now been blown up, and into fighting and resisting the West and the outside world, what's it all been for? So that may be one of the impacts. It's very hard to know what the impacts of military action are going to be, and I think that's always the case. So in doing this, it's a high-risk strategy, and a popular uprising that leads to a collapse of control and chaos, as I was saying earlier, it isn't necessarily good for the Iranian people or for the outside world or its neighbours or for Europe when it comes to refugee flows or anything else. But we just got to hope for a change that brings some relief to the people there and a less threatening behaviour by the government in Iran. And I think that the comments about regime change made by Israeli politicians and by President Trump are they're unfortunate in a way because they enable the Supreme Leader, as you've just been quoting, Simon, to say that just by surviving, he's won. He's been victorious. And if the stated objective, they just stuck to the stated objective of taking out the nuclear program, Iran would have been 100% defeated. If the objective was regime change, then of course Iran can say, well, we won because we're still here. So it's difficult to know what the long-term impacts of the military action will be. I think the key is that not to end up in a situation where this just happens repeatedly, and we just end up with repeated cycles of bombing, which keeps instability in the region. There is an opportunity now to get towards talks that might actually bring a more stable agreement.
And what do you make, Rob, of the British government's inability over the last few days to say whether the strikes have or have not made the world a safer place?
I think it's very hard for anyone to say whether the strikes have made the world a safer place. A lot of those judgments depend on what time frame you're looking at. I think it's undoubtedly a good thing. Iran's nuclear program has been one of the biggest threats to peace and security in the world since it was first discovered in 2002, and the threat from, of course, is not just Iran potentially having that capability. It's the proliferation threat. If other countries see Iran getting it, other countries feeling the need to have nuclear weapons too. So it's absolutely vital to prevent Iran getting the bomb. If this was the only way to do it, then it's clearly been the best outcome. I guess that we're none of us in a position now to know what that looks like or what's going to happen next. Because when you have these military action, you take on a lot of risk.
Yeah, and very opaque, the outcome of that military action still. We're going to talk in the next segment about what regime change might look like were it to occur. What are the options out there? Your questions continuing to come in for Rob Macaire, the former British ambassador to Tehran. He served there from 2018 until 2021. And please keep calling and keep texting, and we're going to get to as many questions as we can between now and 9 o'clock. It is now 13 minutes to 9.
LBC This Morning on Nick Ferrari at Breakfast.
A conspiracy theorist who murdered a much-loved schoolboy in a cannabis-induced sword rampage. Now here's the confrontation when officers found Marcus Monzo standing next to the boy's body.
Drop the sword! Drop it now! Is anybody here who believes in God? Drop it!
Fiona Spargo-Mabs is founder and director of the DSM Foundation, a drugs education charity.
It's just such an important reminder that we really mustn't underestimate the risks that cannabis can have. If you underestimate, then it's much more likely that more people will be developing cannabis-induced psychosis.
Nick Ferrari at Breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio, on Global Player, and the new LBC app. Leading Britain's conversation with Simon Marks. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
History tells us that you've got to be careful what you wish for in Iran. A little bit earlier, I was playing you a bit of LBC archive about the day that the Ayatollah Khomeini left Paris and made his triumphant return to Tehran. And there was this sense of tremendous expectation, enthusiasm and excitement on the streets of Tehran about the fall of the Shah. Let's fast forward just 18 months to December of 1980. When LBC aired an interview with the former Foreign Secretary David Owen. He had been the Foreign Secretary when the Ayatollah returned to power. By December of 1980, he was no longer the Foreign Secretary. And he was asked by LBC about the situation that by then, December of 1980, existed in Iran.
A year ago, I was rather unpopular for saying that it was not in Britain's interests to topple the Shah. I didn't defend the Shah. I was gravely upset by many of the abuses of human rights that had taken place under the Shah's regime. But I predicted then, a year ago, that if the Shah was toppled, there would be shortage of oil, grave regional instability, and above all, I questioned whether the Islamic revolution would be as great a respecter of human rights as some people thought. Well, to my regret, really, because there's no great merit in being right, given the appalling situations developed. Every single one of those predictions has been proven to be right.
Lord Owen, as he is now. Then he was just David Owen, the former Foreign Secretary. And, of course, he was speaking after the siege of the American embassy in Tehran and the hostage crisis there and the growing hostility that the Ayatollah Khomeini, in power just 18 months into his government, was expressing towards the West. So you've got to be careful with predictions. And with that, I'm going to bring in Stephen, who has called the programme from Bishop Stortford. Stephen, good evening to you. What's your question for Rob Macaire?
Oh, good evening. Thanks for taking my call. Yeah, it follows on from that, really. Obviously, I've been reflecting on the Iraqi intervention, and obviously we all know the fallout from that. You know, what would be the fallout if it were to happen in Iran? What would be the sort of the local... We talked about uprisings already. What would be the local effects? What would be the regional effects? Would Iraq be involved, Saudi Arabia, even Russia, the Emiratis? What would you predict the next steps to be? Because presumably, if just the Ayatollah was removed, the IRG would step in. But if the whole regime fell, what would you expect the fallout to be?
Thanks, Stephen. Rob Macaire?
Thanks for the question. I think it's right to draw a distinction between those two different concepts, which both of which describe as regime change. One is some sort of internal power struggle or palace coup that changes the power within the circle of people who currently control things. And the other is a full-blown revolution that brings people out on the streets and overthrows the whole power structure. Now, from my point of view, the first of those is far more likely than the second. To have that sort of violent revolution, you've got to have a couple of things. You've got to have enough people on the streets to overcome the armed security forces, which really means that in practice, those armed security forces, which in Iran are the IRGC and the Basij militia, they would have to change sides, which they're seemingly sign of doing at the moment. And you need some sort of organisation and leadership of that to actually make it happen, some sort of unity in the Iranian people, which doesn't exist because the regime has really dismantled internal opposition, and because externally there isn't a sort of a united, charismatic leadership that is due to step back in. So a lot of those preconditions aren't there. And the question is, what would happen if there were that sort of revolution? Well, I think given that you don't have that sort of leadership in waiting, which is what you saw in Syria with an armed militia that was able to come in and take Damascus and establish a provisional government right away, I think you would see a very, very difficult and dangerous situation in Iran. We've been talking about how big it is, but it's a country where you've got a Kurdish minority, you've got an Arab minority, you've got a sort of Turkish Azeri minority, you've got the Baluchis on the Pakistani border. Any one of whom, or all of whom, might decide that this is the time to sort of seize local control and get what they want, and a lot of them have been very badly oppressed. So it's a central government. Perhaps that is one of the things that you'd see, and then attempts to try to restore that order would potentially lead to a civil war. So none of that's guaranteed, but those are some of the risks that are involved. The scale of chaos, if Iran were to implode in that way, is obviously much greater than the scale of chaos in Iraq or Syria, because it's a much bigger country.
Stephen, thanks for the question. Let's go to Hassan in Westminster, who has a related question. Hassan, what would you like to ask Rob Macaire?
Yes, I mean, considering we were involved in toppling Mossadegh, the last sort of elected Prime Minister of Iran, isn't it a bit controversial for us to be backing or involved with the previous Shah's son, and who seems to be now touring the news channels arguing for a return to Iran?
Hassan, thanks for the question. Hassan is asking about the Shah's son, Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, who is actually normally based in Washington, D.C. and is very much prominent on media channels that broadcast from the United States into Iran. He's now in Paris, I think, at the moment, Rob Macaire. And there are Iranians who hope that he might make a triumphant return to the country, but there are also many who hope that he never sets foot there again. How controversial a figure is he?
Well, I think you've described it very well there, Simon. I mean, it's very hard to know exactly what the level of support inside the country for Reza Pahlavi is. I think a lot of people voice, strong monarchist sentiments in general terms as a way of, they're sort of showing their hatred of the current regime. And there's a bit of a step from that to saying, you want the Crown Prince who has been outside the country all his life to come back in and run it. And I don't think that's necessarily what a lot of people want. But I mean, I say that with all humility, because generalising about a population of 90 million people and trying to predict what would happen is very difficult. But he's obviously a free citizen. He's able to go out and promote himself, as you say, around the airwaves and to try to build support.
But Rob, can I just push you on that? Because I've seen questions from listeners, not actually tonight, but earlier in the week when we were discussing the situation more broadly in the region. Some people suggesting that they think the United States government has basically, he's their choice. He's the person they've been grooming to go in and take over. I'm not clear that is the case, but you would have a much better idea than I do.
Well, you'd have to ask the US government about that. But I think they've been pretty clear in saying that regime change is not a policy. And actually, although President Trump did have that one tweet where he said, make Iran great again. But that just seemed to be a bit of a flash in the pan, because everything he said previously and other presidents said previously have said it's not our policy to be trying to create regime change. And I think people recognise that trying to to do that from outside the country, I mean, it's going to be the people of Iran who take decisions about their future. It's not going to be an external force that does it.
Rob, I must tell you, we've got listeners texting in who say this conversation needs to continue until 10 o'clock, or you must get Rob Macaire back, and indeed we must. I'm going to leave the last question to one of our listeners on text, and it's in many ways the hardest question of the night. Will Iran get a nuclear weapon in the next 10 years?
I don't think that the international community, led by the US, is prepared to let Iran have a nuclear weapon, and I think that's what we've been seeing in recent days. And I very much hope that there's a way to prevent that in a lasting way that is done through negotiation, that allows a change of behaviour in the regime, that uses its current weakness to negotiate something that is sustainable, doesn't result in future waves of military action, but actually instead sort of allows Iran to normalise and to open up a bit to the outside world and give some relief to its people.
And I'm going to wrap this up with a text that has come in from Tim in Welling. He says, we took a package camping holiday to Iran in 1975. We started the tour in Tehran and then travelled north over the mountains to the Caspian Sea coast, then south to Kazvin, Kermanshah, Susa, Shiraz, Isfahan, where the Royal Square is magnificent. The ruins of Persepolis are incredible. Iran was a beautiful country to visit. Well, I hope we've given everybody tonight some fresh insight into what the situation is like in Iran more broadly, and also what opportunity may perhaps one day exist for all of us to walk, at least in the geographic footsteps that our guest tonight, Rob Macaire, was able to take between 2018 and 2021. Rob, I am enormously grateful to you for your time tonight. It has been uplifting and absolutely fascinating, and I hope you'll come back and talk to us again.
Thank you very much, Simon.
Thanks a lot. We're going to go into my final hour with you tonight, and indeed my final hour for this run of shows, and we're going to change directions completely. The Prince and Princess of Wales are being dogged by complaints today about their dogs.
There is absolutely no need to be breeding more puppies into a world where there are already thousands of homeless dogs in the UK being euthanised every single year.
That is the position of the animal rights charity PETA after Prince William and Princess Kate published some very cute photographs of their new puppies. 4 of them were born to Cocker Spaniels owned by the royal couple last month, when animal shelters cannot find homes for more than 100,000 dogs waiting to be adopted right now. Has PETA got a point? Are you comfortable allowing your dogs or other animals to breed? Are you turning to shelters instead? And do we really need to criticise the royal couple over their puppies?
On your radio, on the LBC app, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the Metropolitan Police has apologised and 2 officers have been sacked for gross misconduct after a 15-year-old girl was strip-searched at her school. The teenager had been wrongly accused of possessing cannabis in Hackney in East London in 2020. The search wasn't authorised